So thank you. I will use my arbitrary power as the host of this event to move the schedule a bit. So we are behind schedule, but we will make changes to allow the panel to finish before we take a coffee break. So I think our friends from Chile will understand that their panel will be moved a little later. So Michael, if you could keep your remarks to 15 minutes, and then we'll hopefully take a few questions before the break. Thank you.
All right. Good morning. Thank you very much. This is an honor to speak on such a great panel, and also a challenge. Alex told me, he said, you have to listen to everything that we say, and then you have to wing it. And so I have to follow these great three presentations. And I will say, you know, perhaps it's my pride or something, but usually when I'm in a panel like this, I want to get up and say, well, here's 5 points. But most of them have already been made. So I think it was just really great to listen to all of these speakers. And I think a couple things that stood out to me. The question is the connection between free markets and conservatism. And so we have to ask, what do we mean by free markets? And what do we mean by conservatism? And I think Alex did a great job in kind of laying out some of the tensions. Andre made the very important point from Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell has in his book, Conflict of Visions, he makes a distinction between what he calls a constrained vision, and what's the other one? A tragic vision. Or no, that's constrained, tragic. That's, I think, the same size, right?
Yeah.
That's right. This constrained vision that conservatives...
Vision of the anointed.
Yeah, vision of the anointed. That's right. That the constrained vision says it takes into account complexity. It takes into account human nature, that we're fallen. It takes into account, Robin Harris brought up the knowledge problem. And so the knowledge problem of Hayek is that we don't have enough information to make a perfect decision because we can't predict all the things that take place. And so the part of the conservative vision is that we take human nature seriously. So as I said yesterday, those of you who heard, a lot of it comes down to a right understanding of anthropology. So I would say, so how do we think then about free markets, and how do we think about conservatism? So we have to ask then, what are we trying to conserve? And I think Alex brought this out. So I'm gonna kind of avoid all the deep complexities and try to say that the first thing is we in conservatism, I would say broadly understood, and there are debates, is that we value the human being who is created in the image of God with freedom and has a social nature, has moral responsibility, right? Is good, created good, but fallen. And therefore, as James Madison said, the first task of government is to control the governed. And then the second is to get the governors to control themselves. This is why St. Augustine said, each human being has a libido dominandi, an inordinate will to power. And so we always have to limit the state. We don't trust that the state is going to redeem us. We don't trust that technology is going to redeem us, right? Benedict XVI, beautifully in his encyclical Spe Salvi, points out, we are not redeemed by the state. We're not redeemed by technology. We're redeemed by love and redeemed by God. And so that the conservative has a very realistic understanding that we can never create heaven on earth. What the great, the German-American philosopher Eric Voegelin said, that the modern temptation is to, what he said, is to, these are big words, immanentize the eschaton. And what he means is that the modern temptation is that we're going to create heaven on earth. We're going to solve the problems of evil, sin, suffering, and death with technical solutions. That is politics, economics, education. And that if we can just get things to work right, then everything will fall into place and we will create the perfect society. And we see this from Rousseau, we see it in Marx, we see it in the Fabian socialists, we see it across the board, and we see it in contemporary progressives, right? The communist revolutions are going to wither away the state, everything will fall into place, right? The fascists were going to create a 1,000-year Reich and everything's going to be perfect. And so these are very important because there's really a departure from the Jewish Christian understanding of the world, right? It's a departure of this. And in many ways, I think this is correct, Marxism is one of the last great heresies, right? It's a departure. So in the Jewish and Christian understanding, what do we, and especially Catholic understanding, what do we see? That God creates the world. He declares it good. He calls us to participate in creation, right? But that the Tower of Babel cannot be built, right? And that we must seek after justice, but it will always be relative justice because we cannot attain perfect justice. Not in this world, right? And the heresy says, no, we don't need God. We don't need covenant. We don't need Jesus. We can do it ourselves, right? And so in a sense, what Sol, although he doesn't use this language, is articulating in the constrained vision, the conservative vision, is actually a realization that human beings are good. We're called to participate in creation, to participate in redemption, but we cannot redeem ourselves. There is no technical solution to the problems of evil, sin, suffering, and death. And so when we have that beginning, then we say, okay, how do we then organize our society? And then part of the conservative tradition is we believe in the things that have been said: private property, rule of law, freedom of association, free exchange, etc. These things, and I'll talk about those in a second. And so then we say, okay, how do we, what are the goals of our life? Well, if each of us is created in the image of God and we have freedom and responsibility, then each of us has an opportunity, a moral responsibility, and an opportunity to live out our freedom and our responsibilities. So what role does then, and what is the goal of politics? The goal of politics is to create the conditions for justice and for social and personal flourishing. These are the goals of politics. So the goals of politics, again, are not to solve the problem of evil, because we can't. And every time we try to solve the problem of evil, as Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI said, it enslaves us, disappoints us. And later we're going to talk about the crimes of communism. 100 million people are dead because of a lack of constrained vision, right? The Nazis, the communists, right? The fascists, the Chinese, right? Here in Croatia, you know this, I don't have to tell you. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people were killed by an unconstrained vision that says we can solve the problem of evil. And the conservative says we cannot solve the problem of evil. Okay, but that we cannot solve the problem of evil does not mean that we don't care about justice. And so how do we create the most just societies we can, recognizing the knowledge problem and recognizing trade-offs that Robin brought out? There's trade-offs. So we say, well, you need rule of law. You need private property, right? And we go through these things, and we could go through all of them. So what I'd like to do is just say how conservative these things are. And what I mean by conservative is I'm not going to talk about Thomas Sowell, who I like very much. I'd like your book, please. I'm not going to talk about Hayek. I'm going to go way back before this and talk about the sources of these justice. And these come deeply out of the biblical tradition, right? And the medieval tradition. These are not brand new ideas that came out of the Enlightenment. They have a rich tradition. So we talked about Edmund Burke before, and one of the things that Burke sees is that we have trial and error. We have complexity. And I said conservatives recognize complexity. So let me tell you what I mean by this, that we are embedded. One of the ways to think about how to think about the economy in light of conservative ideas is that we are embedded. What do I mean by that? Let's think for just a moment, what is required for this conversation to take place? We are embedded. We are living, first of all, we're in a beautiful room, held up in a building with concrete and steel and all of the ideas and innovations and developments over time that make this possible. I have a microphone, there's lights, there's computers, there's bandwidth, there's all these things. Deeply complex. I did a short documentary film on the global supply chain of a cup of espresso, which we're going to get. How do you say? Molin vas kavo. Oh, molin vas kavo. Okay. So do you know how long and how complex it is to get a cup of espresso? Okay. It takes thousands of people and thousands of products to get 1 cup of espresso. And we just drink it. No big deal. We are using, a shared cultural artifact called the English language to communicate with one another. The complexity is incredibly deep. We are embedded in complexity. Now, there's a modern Italian economist. Her name is Mariana Mazzucato, and she's a very well-respected economist, and she's very interesting. And she makes this point. I have critiques of her, but she makes a very important point against free marketers. She says, you think the free market made this iPhone? You think the free market's the source of the iPhone? No, it's not. Because almost everything that makes the smartphone smart, Mazzucato argues, was made by U.S. military and by DARPA, these government-led products. And this is a real critique of free marketers. And I would say she's actually partially right, because it wasn't just invented. Now, but she makes some errors. The first error she makes is she thinks, it seems the way, because she has this idea that we need moonshots. We need to take the government to get together, and just like we got to the moon, we have to solve cancer. She thinks that just as the free marketer the libertarian free marketer who doesn't respect tradition might think this just popped out of nowhere, so too, this will not arise without the innovative creation of the free market that Alex talked about, why you need innovators, why you need low barriers to entry. And one of the reasons in California there's so much technology is because there's no non-compete clauses. You can leave one company and start another, right? So there's this ability for innovation. So she neglects that. The second, she's too optimistic, I would argue, about moonshots. The 20th century is an example of moonshot after moonshot after moonshot that failed. Okay, we got to the moon, but we failed with the war on poverty. We failed with foreign aid humanitarianism that has delayed the development of business and kept poor people locked in and excluded. Okay, I made a documentary about that. It's called Poverty Inc. Please watch it. Okay, because it's a deep problem. We failed in the United States with the standard American diet. We're going to solve heart attacks. So we told all the Americans, eat high carbohydrate, low fat diets. And you know what that made everybody? Fat and sick. Okay? Because the government told us what to eat. Okay? We tried to sterilize millions of Indians between the Indian government in the United States and the World Bank. And we've created massive population problems by creating huge population problems and population control schemes. Our moonshots have failed and have failed and have failed. So that's the other problem, which is the knowledge problem. There's this sense like this time we'll get it right. And I haven't mentioned all the moonshots of the 5-year plans of the Soviet Union and all the other things that just destroyed families. So moonshots don't work because of the knowledge problem. But even the deeper problem of Mazzucato goes to the last point I'd like to make. Here's my question. Let's say she's right, but she partially is, okay? The military built this, and DARPA, it's a big defense project in the United States. So, okay, why do we have such a military? Why did we have so much money for the military to invest in this? Oh, well, we won World War II. Oh, why did we win World War II? Well, we were from the outside. And we already had an industrial economy. Oh, why did we have an industrial economy? Well, because we had this development. And why does the government have so much money? Well, we have a really big tax base. Oh, well, why do we have a big tax base? Oh, well, we have a commercial society. Oh, why do we have a commercial society? Oh, we have a constitutional republic. Well, why do we have a constitutional republic? Right? Oh, well, actually, we had a democratic life in America 150 years before the Constitution. We practiced this. Well, where did we get that from? Well, in 1620, on the Mayflower ship, they signed the Mayflower Compact. Oh, the Mayflower Compact. You mean 70 years before Locke wrote about social contract, there was social contract in America? Yes. Where do we get that? Oh, well, actually, there's social contract all over the medieval period. what would be an example of social contract? The Magna Carta. Oh, the Magna Carta has actual rights for merchants in the Magna Carta. Okay. And what about the ideas of private property? Well, do you know Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa Theologica talks about the importance of private property, that he uses Aristotle and the Hebrew Bible. Okay. Why do we have private property? Well, what does he say about private property, right? And Alex talked about it. It's the most important, the best way to have social cooperation in the fallen world. And I won't go into the details, but I'm happy to give you the links if you'd like to read them. Okay. What else do we have? Well, rule of law. Thomas Aquinas says in, I think it's questions 90 through 94 on the treatise in law, he says, what should law look like? Well, law should be promulgated so everybody knows. It cannot be retroactive. It has to apply to everybody equally, right? It cannot, there has to be rule of law and not rule of men. So you can't have the judge be the guy's brother-in-law. All right. And it goes through this whole explanation of rule of law. Well, these things that we take for granted are deep in Aquinas. Let's go back further. Why do we have private property? Well, did you know in Genesis 23, Abraham buys a plot of land for his wife, Sarah, and he doesn't kill him. He pays him for it. And they said, well, we'll give it to you. He says, no, I want to pay for it because I want title to land. In Exodus 22, it says private property. Right? In 2 Samuel 12, when David offers sacrifice after the plague, after he had done an evil by doing a census. Let's think about that for a minute. Okay. He got a plague for having a census. Now if that's not a limited government position, what is? And he goes up to the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, which became the place where the temple was built. And he said, I want to offer sacrifice. And Araunah says, oh, here are my animals. And he says, I will not offer sacrifice to God unless I own them, private property. It's all throughout the Hebrew Bible. Justice that I mentioned in Aquinas, Leviticus 19:16 says that there should be no partiality in justice. Don't judge the poor or the rich with special elements. So modern social justice says if you're poor or disenfranchised, you get special treatment. And crony capitalism, which is a terrible thing, says if you're rich, you get special treatment. But the Hebrew Bible says, no, impartiality. And we see this echoed in the epistle of St. James. This is deep in our tradition. Private property, rule of law, freedom of association. St. Thomas Aquinas, in the year 1256, made one of the first arguments against monopoly rights because the bishops told the Franciscans and the Dominicans, you can't teach in universities. And so listen to this. Bonaventure, whose feast day is in 2 days, St. Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas are called by the Pope. I mean, can you imagine? St. Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas knew each other, okay? And he says, come down and make a defense. And Thomas argued that human beings have a social nature, and we are allowed to join together to do things for which we are competent that benefit the common good. And the bishops can't tell us not to teach, because we have a natural right of association. Okay. Leo XIII quotes that in Rerum Novarum. Right. This is part of our tradition. I'm skipping around. In private property, Leo XIII makes a very important point. Why does private property matter? Because it creates space for the family to live out its freedom and its responsibility. Even if private property were less efficient, and I could show you maps, I have pictures of the correlations between property and prosperity. Even if private property were less economically efficient, it would still be good because it creates space for families to live out their freedom and responsibility. And where does culture get passed down? From this mayor? From the priest? No, from the parents. So you need family to create space. And this is why socialists of all stripes, as I said yesterday, always try to destroy the family. Because what the Catholic Church recognizes in all its documents is that family, private property, and religion are mutually reinforcing. And you know who knows that better than the Catholics? The socialists. Because the socialists always go after private property, religion, and family, because they're mutually reinforcing. Okay? So I could go on, but I know there's time limits and you need kavu. Okay? But the point I would like to make here at the end is that, and the last thing I want to say about free exchange, Alex has done incredible work on the development of the ideas of free exchange, all in the medieval and the late scholastic tradition. He has a very important book called Faith and Liberty. I highly recommend this book. I remember when I read it in my early 30s, late 20s, I was so excited. And now I have the honor to actually work with Alex. I mean, I was like, who's this Alex, man, who wrote this great book? And now I'm honored to work with him. And he points out these ideas of just price that include utility, difficulty, and guess what? Common estimation. This is a market price. Also are discussed in the medieval and the late scholastic period. So the way to think about markets, a lot of the kind of movements today, and I'll end with this. A lot of the movements today are very worried. The conservatives are very worried. They're worried because woke capitalism. Right? They're worried because, as was said earlier, that the introduction said, markets are being used to fund socialist elements. I remember in 2008 or 7 or something, 7, it must have been, Zapatero in Spain had lower corporate tax rates than the conservative George Bush while he was attacking the family and life and everything. And it struck me that I mentioned yesterday, socialism uses markets to obtain its ends. And so people are understandably worried about big tech. I am too. I'm very critical of those things and markets. And so I would like to say that I understand why people are concerned, but this is why we have to think in both context and in principles. We cannot throw out our principles because we're worried about a problem. Because if you throw out the principles, then what happens is exactly what happened in Argentina. Bad guys come in and they destroy your country. So you have to keep the principles going. But we also have to remember that we're not libertarians in the sense of like, we like markets, but just because there's a market for something doesn't mean there should be a market for something. There should not be a market for eggs or sperm or selling wombs or selling your organs. There should not be a market for transgender surgeries that big pharma is making millions of dollars off of. There should not be a market that sells young girls into sexual slavery. There should not be markets for lots of things. So we can, using rule of law and moral conservative principles, say we really like the free market because we believe in what's called commutative justice, right? This means the justice of exchange. We believe in commutative justice. It's part of our tradition. But just because there's commutative justice for buying watches and papers and glasses and things, it doesn't mean that you treat your family with commutative justice. It doesn't mean that because there's a commutative justice with, again, a pair of glasses or an iPhone, you cannot engage in commutative justice with persons. You cannot engage in commutative justice with sperm and eggs and wombs and organs. That's not a space for commutative justice. And our tradition helps us make those distinctions. And so I would say that as we think about how to think about conservatism, there's lots of areas we need to address. There's lots of complexity, but we have to take complexity seriously. We have to be careful that we are precise in our language, like Alex pointed out. One of the greatest little tiny books is called The Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power by the great philosopher Josef Pieper. It's very little. I mean, you can read it in one sitting. Abuse of language, abuse of power. Language, precision is required. But as we think about free markets and we think about conservatism, realizing that the institutions of justice, private property, rule of law, freedom of association, free exchange, these are cultural institutions that come out of a deep Jewish Christian heritage, of the biblical heritage, and they are part of our tradition, and they are the things that have created the most ability for human beings to flourish. But they can never be separated. They're not simple technical things that the Chinese can use to abuse people. When we say free markets, we don't just mean technocratic elements of private property for a select few. We mean deep questions of justice. And there is how I think the market and conservatism and human flourishing all align together. Thank you for your time.